Once upon a time in a bustling city, there lived a pair of ducks named Mr. and Mrs. Mallard. They were a loving couple who had spent many happy days swimming in ponds and waddling through parks. Now, with spring in the air, they were dreaming of a place to settle down and raise a family. They wanted a spot that was not only safe, but also filled with enough food for their future ducklings. One fine morning, Mr. and Mrs. Mallard flew over the city, searching for the perfect home. As they soared above tall buildings and crowded streets, Mrs. Mallard looked down and spotted a beautiful green park. It was surrounded by trees, with a sparkling pond right in the middle. The scene looked perfect, so they decided to land and take a closer look. The park was indeed lovely, with plenty of space to swim and soft grass to nestle in. The trees were tall, providing shade from the sun, and there were gentle breezes that ruffled their feathers just right. Mr. Mallard quacked with excitement, thinking this could be the home they'd been looking for. But before they could make their decision, Mrs. Mallard noticed something troubling. As she waddled closer to the streets, she saw how busy and noisy the roads were. Cars and bicycles zoomed past, honking and ringing their bells. The sight of it all made Mrs. Mallard nervous. She knew that it could be dangerous for their future ducklings to cross those busy streets. "Maybe this isn't the best place after all," Mrs. Mallard said with a sigh. Determined to find the perfect spot, Mr. and Mrs. Mallard decided to keep looking. They flew over the city again and soon found themselves near a quiet river. The water was calm, and there were reeds swaying along the banks. They landed on the soft mud and paddled around for a while. It seemed peaceful, and there were plenty of fish and plants to eat. "This might be the place," said Mr. Mallard, feeling hopeful, but as the day went on, they started to miss the liveliness of the city. The quiet river was nice, but it didn't feel quite right. They missed the people, the laughter of children, and the friendly park visitors who sometimes tossed breadcrumbs. So, they decided to fly back to the city and give it one more try. After flying in circles for a while, Mrs. Mallard spotted a small, hidden island in the middle of a large pond in the city's public garden. The island was surrounded by tall grasses, and there were no busy streets nearby. It was a peaceful oasis right in the heart of the bustling city. It felt both safe and welcoming. "This is it," Mrs. Mallard quacked joyfully. "This is the perfect spot to raise our family." Mr. Mallard agreed. They decided to build their nest right there on the island, hidden among the grasses. Days turned into weeks, and soon Mrs. Mallard laid 8 shiny, white eggs. She and Mr. Mallard were thrilled as they eagerly awaited the arrival of their ducklings. While Mrs. Mallard kept the eggs warm in the nest, Mr. Mallard explored the city, looking for the best places to find food. He made friends with the people who walked by the pond and even found a policeman who always had a handful of peanuts for him. One sunny morning, the eggs began to hatch. One by one, the ducklings poked their heads out of the shells, blinking at the world with wide, curious eyes. Mrs. Mallard was so proud as she watched her little ones waddle around the nest, peeping excitedly. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard named their ducklings Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack. The ducklings were fluffy and full of energy, always eager to explore. But before they could venture out too far, Mrs. Mallard decided they needed to learn some important lessons. She spent the next few days teaching them how to swim in the pond, dive for food, and follow her lead whenever she quacked. The ducklings listened carefully and practiced until they were ready. Mrs. Mallard knew that the time had come to take them to the park, where there would be more space to play and swim. The next morning, Mrs. Mallard gathered her ducklings in a neat row. "We're going for a walk," she announced. "Stay close and always follow me." The ducklings quacked in agreement, eager for their first adventure outside the island. Mrs. Mallard led them out of the pond, up the bank, and onto the path that led to the city streets. As they approached the busy road, Mrs. Mallard remembered how dangerous it was, so she came up with a plan. She asked the kind policeman, who had become a friend, to help them cross the street. The policeman was delighted to see the Mallard family and quickly stopped the traffic. Cars and bicycles came to a halt as the mother duck and her ducklings waddled across the road in a perfectly straight line. The people on the sidewalk smiled and pointed at the adorable sight, and some even took pictures. The ducklings waddled along behind their mother, following her every step. Jack, cack, lack, mack, knack, whack, pack, and quack all did their best to keep up, their little feet pattering on the pavement. Once they safely crossed the street, Mrs. Mallard led them through the park, past the pond, and all the way to their new home in the garden. The ducklings were overjoyed to see all the new places to explore, from the bubbling fountain to the shady trees. They splashed in the pond, chased each other through the grass, and made new friends with the park visitors. Every day, the family enjoyed their time in the park. The people who visited always stopped to admire them and would often bring treats for the ducklings. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were so happy they had found the perfect place to raise their family, a spot that was both safe and filled with life. As the sun set each evening, the ducklings would gather close to their mother on the grassy bank of the pond. She would tell them stories and sing them lullabies until they drifted off to sleep, their little heads tucked under their wings. And so, in the heart of the city, surrounded by the laughter of children, the rustling of leaves, and the gentle ripples of the pond, Mr. and Mrs. Mallard, along with their 8 little ducklings, lived happily ever after in their perfect city home. The end.